Hello everyone, and welcome to this hopefully brief presentation of a fairly complex topic, systemic functional linguistics and its relationship to critical discourse analysis. My name is George Ross. I'm a PhD student here at the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies, but I also have quite a background in teaching things like rhetoric, academic writing, communication. I've done research in medical communication, which is my interest right now, but also things like analysis of video games and web media, or news media and advertising. I've used this particular framework, or a kind of variation of it, to do a master's thesis on news media portrayals of the Iraq War back in kind of the mid-2000s. So this is a topic that's quite close to my heart. I also do need to caution you in advance that this is probably going to seem a little complicated. You can take several courses in systemic functional linguistics and still be confused about some of the concepts, but hopefully this will at least give you a little bit of a preview. Certainly, if you have a bit of a background in linguistics, like traditional grammar analysis, syntax, morphology, phonology, things of that sort, it might help you follow along with this presentation, but I'm going to try and make it accessible to everyone. And really, my goal is to hopefully give you kind of a possible set of tools that you may be able to use in your final projects for this course. I do want to caution you, though, that if you are choosing this framework, be very careful to think about the reasons for why you may be choosing it for your analysis, and if you're going to be combining it with any of the other approaches in the course, make sure that your frameworks are actually compatible. So I'll mention this a little bit later, but for example, if you pick systemic functional linguistics and you start talking about genre, the idea of genre actually means something a little bit different in systemic functional linguistics than what it does in, let's say, rhetorical genre analysis, which I believe you've already been introduced to. So, what are systemic functional linguistics and critical discourse analysis? They're two related theories on language and discourse. So, we'll come back to definitions of discourse a little bit later. Often, but not always, these two are used together. So, if you look at, in particular, some of the research that's being done in Australia, this is kind of Australia, sort of the hotbed of systemic functional linguistics and CDA. Over there, those two approaches are often combined. In Europe, for example, there are quite a number of CDA theorists that just do CDA without really getting into the kind of nitty-gritty linguistics. So the reason they work so well together is because basically they've, on the one hand, they've been designed in a way around each other. Certainly Sfl and Cda, they developed around the same time, sort of the late 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and kind of going forward. They've developed in parallel, and many of the theorists that do them do both. So, what is the difference between them? Well, Sfl, or systemic functional linguistics, is a kind of perspective on formal structures of language, what we might refer to as things like grammar, style, punctuation, which is essentially describes what language or what different types of discourse do. So while Sfl, linguistics being part of the definition, obviously deals with language, there are kind of theoretical and analytical approaches based on systemic functional linguistics that are used for analyzing things like pictures, visuals, or even music. So you can actually apply systemic functional analysis to more than just language, which I'll touch on again later. Critical discourse analysis, or CDA as we'll refer to it, is a perspective on wider context and implications of language, discourse, communication, aiming to explain why language or discourse does what it does. So, if you will, those two theories go hand in hand. Sfl looks at what language is, what language does, whatever language that happens to be, and CDA is a look at why that happens. So often SFL is used as a set of tools for doing CDA. Researchers create a very detailed analysis of the language features to help explain some of the broader patterns in the discourse. So why is this useful? Well, basically what I really like about combining SFL and CDA is often when you're analyzing a piece of text, let's say you want to understand why an advertising works, or let's say you're dealing with an even more sensitive topic and you're trying to explain why a particular piece of text might be coming off as, let's say, racist or sexist. If you do it in a very informal way, sure, you can point to certain things, say that, this is implying that, so therefore it's kind of not a good thing. SFL, what it does is actually gives you some very specific tools, some very specific things that you can point to, and not just point to, but also explain in terms of a kind of system that helps you really justify those explanations. So it's very useful in that sense. So without further ado, we'll get into systemic functional linguistics. So in systemic functional linguistics, first of all, just to sort of step back, the definition. So linguistics, as I've already said, I'm sure some of you in the class might even be linguistics majors. Linguistics is a study of language as a system. And it looks at things like, again, grammar, syntax, phonology, morphology, kind of the sounds and the letters and the grammar of language. Here we're really interested in the part that says systemic functional because, it's different from traditional linguistics. So, systemic means a theory that looks at language as a set of systems that work together to produce different types of meaning. What's important here is that systemic functional linguistics looks at language or at any grammatical system as a system of choices. Why was one way of saying something chosen over another? And again, we'll return to it when we talk about critical discourse analysis because that helps answer some of the why questions. But what's important to underline here is systemic functional linguistics looks at language as always a choice. Functional, on the other hand, this is where SFL is different from traditional grammar. So traditional grammar might look at things like parts of speech, verb, adjective, noun, determiner, so on and so forth. Or it might look at parts of a sentence, subject, verb, object. Functional linguistics isn't that interested in what things are in language. It's much more interested in what language does. So this is quite different from traditional linguistics. We can compare them this way. So traditional linguistics is concerned with form. You take a sentence, something like, the police quickly removed protesters from the controversial site in the morning. If you try to analyze that sentence and break it down into what the parts of speech are and what role they play in the sentence, you might get something like this. The police, that's determiner noun, and the subject of the sentence. Quickly is an adverb, remove is verb, protesters is a noun, from is a preposition, the is another determiner, controversial is adjective, site is a noun. And then, quickly removed is part of the verb phrase, protesters is an object, and from the controversial site, that's a preposition phrase. So again, those of you studying linguistics, you're probably very familiar with this kind of notation. You might even draw a nice little tree to represent that sentence. Those of you who aren't in linguistics, don't worry about it, but this basically describes how traditional linguists might analyze that sentence. Now, here's how an SFL analyst might look at that sentence. SFL is really interested in the function of all the different parts of speech. So instead of asking, what is the subject of the sentence or what is the object of the sentence, it might ask, who are the participants described by the sentence? What are the processes instead of saying verbs? What are the processes that are taking place? What attitudes and orientations are expressed or implied by the text? And how is this text organized? So for any text, obviously, other than just words on paper or words spoken by someone, what you also have is kind of a description of a situation. There is some kind of events described or some kind of processes described. These involve someone or something. There are some attitudes implied by that text, and that text is organized in some way. So, a systemic functional analyst would look at the sentence as follows. Instead of looking at the subject, they would say, aha, the police are a participant and the police are the actor. What's taking place is a material process. Someone or something is being quickly removed. And what is being removed is a participant called a goal. I'll explain those in a moment. We'll go through all of these in a little bit more detail. And from the controversial site, that is a circumstance describing a location, a place in the physical world. A systemic functional analyst would also say that the police is the theme of that sentence, and the rest of it is what we call a reme, and we'll come back to it in a moment. They would also say that the mood of the sentence is comprised of the police quickly removed up to here, and the rest of it is residue, and the mood is declarative. In other words, this is a statement. This is not a question. It doesn't say, did the police remove protesters from the controversial site? Because that would be an interrogative type of sentence. But no, it's a declarative sentence. And finally, there is also a information structure implied to it. The police are a given. In other words, this is what we know. This is what's information that's not new at all. And then the rest of it is new information. Quickly remove protesters from the controversial site. So we'll come back to this in a moment. So, according to systemic functional linguistics, as we just saw, language has several different functions. And specifically, we just looked at 3 different types of functions, which are sort of taking a big picture applied. So language, or pictures, or even music, or other types of communications. But when we're talking about linguistics, we're talking about language. Language is there to relay some form of information or experience or some form of content. That's the first function of communication. Secondly, communication conveys attitude, stance, emotion, and manages interpersonal relationships or relations. That's the second function of language. And thirdly, any kind of communication structures texts. And here I'm using text in a very broad sense. It could be a written or typed text. It could be a spoken text. It could be a picture. But communication is always structured in a way that makes the text coherent and cohesive. So coherent meaning something makes sense, easy to follow, corresponds to what the audience or the listener or the reader might know about the rest of the world. And cohesive is that it's structured, put together in a way that makes sense. This kind of, speaking of it more technically, is what's called the 3 meta functions of the language. So the 3 big functions, they're kind of the overarching, the meta functions of language, which is the ideational meta function. So this is kind of asking, what information does the text contain? What is the information that's actually in there? There is the interpersonal metafunction. It's also sometimes called the attitudinal metafunction. How does the text enact attitudes and social relationships? And the textual metafunction, which is asking, how is the text structured? How is it linked to other texts? And how is it linked to the wider world or the wider discourse outside of the text itself? This is getting a little bit technical, so I'm just going to give you a very broad overview. But basically, Sfl says that in fulfilling these 3 functions, the ideational meaning, the interpersonal meaning, and the textual meaning, any text will draw on a set of resources. So in language, for example, it'll draw on resources on different levels. The lowest level, for those of you studying linguistics, you kind of start out with studying phonetics and phonology, the different sounds of language and how they're put together. So phonetics, articulation of sounds, and phonology is patterns of sounds. Or in writing, for example, that would be graphology, presentation of the text, the choice of fonts. So recall what I said earlier, that systemic functional linguistics looks at all communication, all language, as a system of choices. So even at this low level, let's say the sounds that you choose, the way that you, let's say, choose fonts in a written text, that is already a choice, and it's made for a reason. And the reasons have to do with expressing one of these meanings. So either the content, the attitude, or the organization of a text. So, for example, tone and intonation can convey attitudes. Choice of font can do the same thing. Sometimes it gets really confusing. I remember, for example, receiving a letter about my OSAP student loans that was printed on yellow paper in Comic Sans. For any of you that have kind of had to deal with student loans and OSAP, you know that's really kind of frustrating, and that, you know, that made me angry. And it made me angry because it seemed like, you know, someone either made a choice to sort of mock me, or someone just didn't think about that choice. You know, they were dealing with something that's really quite important to any student who is on, you know, has student loans or receiving assistance of some kind. And, you know, to present it in this silly font on yellow paper kind of sends a message, whether it's intentional or not. So that's what I mean. In the same way, for example, things like pauses or tonal cues, or let's say spacing of text into paragraphs or into lines, or let's say you just have, you know, if this slide only had one word in the middle of it, or even, you know, at the top here we have the title, that implies that this is more important or kind of more encompassing than all the rest of this stuff down here. So, and it's the same with speech. So, for example, if I make a dramatic pause, that might imply that I have something really important to say. So, again, system of choices. This also works at the level of lexical grammar. So this is kind of what we talked about in this slide. Whenever you see kind of where things are placed in a sentence, so, you know, the police comes first, and then there's the process, and it's a material process, quickly removed. Those are choices, and those are made for reasons. And we'll come back to why this is important when we talk about processes in a moment. Secondly, there is the issue of interpersonal meaning and attitude. So again, tone of sentences and implied attitude. So for example, if a sentence is a statement, the police quickly removed protesters from a controversial site, that implies something that's factual. That's just a thing that happened. If the sentence read something like, why did the police remove protesters from the controversial site? That's a whole different message. That's asking something, right? And if it's asking something, maybe that is something that can be disagreed with, where it's much harder to disagree with something that's stated as a fact. At least you're the one that kind of, you know, if you're going to disagree with it, then you're the one that has to ask that question. And that's very intentional. And then there's thematic or information structure. So cues that guide the reader to specific information within the sentence. So, as I said, when we're talking about this idea of theme and reme, for example, so the police is the focus of the sentence. What if the sentence read, the protesters were removed from the controversial site? Suddenly it becomes about the protesters, and the police sort of disappear from the sentence. And again, if you wanted to really put the focus on the protesters and not the police, then you would make that sentence differently. And that's another linguistics choice. So again, it's cues guiding the reader to specific information within the text. And it also works at the level which we call discourse semantics, which is really the high level. So, for example, in terms of content of the text, we can talk about what is included in it, what is excluded. So, for example, if you have a text about the protesters and the police, some kind of standoff, and the police aren't even mentioned in the sentence, what does that imply? If, let's say, everything is being described as violence, looting, disorder, again, what does that imply? What kind of perspectives does it include? What kind of perspectives does it leave out? And why? The why is sort of the critical discourse analysis question we'll come back to later. Interpersonal. So how is the content presented? What are relational patterns it implies? Again, remember my example with, yellow paper, Comic Sans font. What does that imply in terms of the power relationship here? What might my professor say if I submitted a paper that was written, in completely illegible font, or, it was totally unreadable or something like that? The professor might not be very impressed. And yet, for example, if something that's kind of poorly written is attributed to some kind of important figure, people are going to spend years and years trying to decipher that same illegible note because the person that said it is important. So again, choices. And textual meaning, so structure and patterns of reference. So again, for example, the way that paragraphs in a text are organized, the way that headings might be organized, chapters, or links to a broader context. This is especially something that gets interesting, for example, in when you're dealing with web texts. There's actual links you can click that lead to other pages that might sort of reveal what the source is based on. And so, broadly speaking, you don't have to memorize this diagram, but this is to say that systemic functional linguistics covers a number of different concepts through three different functions, so the ideational, interpersonal, and textual, at different levels, starting at the low level of kind of phonology or graphology, so the sounds of a language, the letters, the actual physical fonts of the writing, moving into lexicography, so grammar, then discourse semantics, and then kind of at a higher level, you might have heard these terms before, genre and register. So key point here, the definition of genre and register are different in systemic functional linguistics than they are in other theories that you might be familiar with. So for example, register is the choice of field, tenor, and mode. So this is kind of, let's say, within academic writing, there is, reflection papers, there is analytical essays, there might be book reports. So those are kind of the registers, and genre is the whole situation. So genre is the overarching context. So genre would be academic writing is a genre. A academic essay is a particular register within that genre. So you want to be very careful when you're mixing SFL with other perspectives on genre, like rhetorical genre studies, because they might not necessarily mean the same thing when they say the same words. But anyway, this is not something that you necessarily have to recognize. It's just kind of a map of how systemic functional linguistics looks at language. It goes from kind of the lowest level of the sounds and the letters all the way out to the social situation in which communication occurs. And it treats all things as choices. So again, even within a genre, let's say choosing to present something as an analytical essay versus choosing to present something as a blog. Those are actually two kind of different registers, what SFL theorists might call registers. And, a YouTube blog or vlog versus a academic written essay, they imply very different choices. They're going to be read by different people. They're going to be perceived very differently. So that's important to keep in mind, because in presenting their message, whoever created that text obviously made a choice somewhere for reasons. So now to get into a little bit of detail, because a lot of what I talked about is probably very abstract and vague, and I want to kind of very briefly run over the specifics. So we talked about, when we talked about the three big functions of language, the ideational, so what information does the text contain, the interpersonal, what attitudes and social relationships are implied by the text, and textual is how is the text organized, how does it connect to other texts. So in the first of those, the content of a text, when we're looking at it at a low-level grammatical level, at a lexical grammatical level, Sfl says we look at the system of transitivity. And transitivity in Sfl is made up of three things. So what we talked about with this example right here, the participants, the processes, and circumstances. So there's several different types of processes that you want to look out for, and each of these processes takes on different types of participants. So I'm just going to do a very kind of blitz run through this, because I realize we don't have hours and hours to talk about this topic. But there's several different possible process types. The first process type is material. Material processes are processes of doing something, usually physically in the real world. And material processes take on two types of participants: the actor, the doer or the thing that is doing something, and a goal or beneficiary, who, what is receiving the result of the action. So let's look at these four examples. Coming back to our first one, the police surrounded the protesters. Right, the police surrounded the protesters, so they physically surrounded them. So there's some interesting things that when a material process has chosen something over other types of processes that we'll talk about in a minute, there's several implications. The first of these is that this is implied to be a real, concrete, immediate action with real-world consequences. And when combined with ideas about power and violence, can be disconcerting and therefore avoided. So if an article that wanted to really kind of portray the police in a more positive light use that sentence, well, they probably wouldn't use that sentence because that sounds kind of threatening. The police surrounded the protesters. So from here, you might already be able to surmise that this article might be more sympathetic to the protesters, which is important. Also, what's interesting is when this choice of processes used with inanimate objects, in other words, objects that can't move or actually do things on their own, implying that those objects have agency. For example, in advertising, like our second sentence, this car takes you to new places. Well, sure, the car physically moves, but does the car really actually take you on its own? So it's interesting because it's ascribing abilities to a car, which technically it might not have. What's also important is who or what is labeled as the actor and what is the goal can be tremendously important because it might imply or remove responsibility or blame. So coming back to our first example, the police surrounded the protesters. It sounds like the police are the ones who started it, right? Whereas if it says, the protesters caused disorder and forced the police to show up, well, it's suddenly the protesters who are the actors. So it's their responsibility. It also gets really interesting, and this is something that I always tell students to watch for, is whenever you see the pronoun we, it gets really interesting. So for example, you might say, we fought for our freedom in World War II. Well, how many people alive today actually fought in World War II compared to the rest of the population? Very few. But who does that we refer to? Who is we? It might be, let's say Canadians or the free world or Americans, which is interesting, of course, especially for those of you who might, for example, have relatives from Germany who happen to be on the other side of World War II at the time. Well, that suddenly makes it interesting. But this collective identity of we is important. And also agentless passive. So this is something that I saw very much of when studying the depictions of the Iraq War. You see sentences like, the missile was launched at the target. Who is the actor here? Well, actually, there is no actor because was launched is passive. So was launched, whenever you see a passive sentence, if it said something like, the missile was launched by an American airplane at the target, the American airplane is the actor. The missile is just, the missile is the goal. So it's interesting because agentless passives actually hide the actor. And again, you might say the protesters were surrounded. Who were they surrounded by? Sentence doesn't say. So by itself, you might say that this is just, kind of semantics, which really to an extent it is. It is, of course, semantics plus lexical grammar. But it isn't merely nitpicking on details. Really what you have here is something more than that. Because it's one thing if you only see this once in a text or once in a group of texts. It's a whole different issue when you start seeing a pattern of these things. So something like the missile was launched at the target. When you have 10 different articles that all use this same kind of construction, the same passive, without a clear actor to it, then it gets really interesting. So this is what Sfl analysis usually involves. It's not so much just finding one example of something and saying, oh, that means, this article is, encouraging violence or supporting the war, or this article is supporting the protesters or something like that. Sure, you can say it about one instance, but where it really gets interesting is where you see a whole pattern where this happens over and over and over and over. And that's important. We can contrast this to a second common type of process, which is mental processes. And again, how do you define something as a, mental or material or one of the other couple of types of processes? It's really kind of an analysis, but you can sort of learn it by contrast. So let's say, surrounds, takes, fights, launches. Those are all physical actions, where here, observes, knows, identifies. Those are not verbs that describe physical actions. They might kind of be talking about physical actions, but they're not, physical. So mental processes are processes of thinking or sensing, and they have two types of possible participants: the sensor, the one who is thinking or sensing something, and a phenomenon, what is being sensed, perceived, or thought. So contrast this to our previous examples where we said, police surrounded the protesters. Here we have police observed the protesters. So suddenly this doesn't sound so immediate, violent, like it's, some kind of a physical confrontation, right? They're just observing, they're watching, even though this might actually be an article, it might be a sentence from an article describing the exact same real world situation. So what does this mean? First of all, mental processes are more abstract, distant, or vague because observation and thought is passive. It's not active. So suddenly this can be used to kind of cool things down a little bit. So, police observed the protesters. Or, in the case of this kind of war sentence, the target was identified from several miles away. Again, notice that it's a passive construction, but still, missile was launched. There's still something violent going on. Target was identified. Well, you really have to start digging into and trying to understand, well, target, does it mean that something hit it? Sentence doesn't say it. So again, it's kind of hiding or removing the reader of the text from the physicality of it, the messiness of it. It always implies that the subject, and notice I say always, is sentient, intelligent, and so it can be used to ascribe human-like qualities to inanimate objects. For example, in advertising discourse. Look at this sentence. This car knows how to have fun. Do cars actually know anything? Probably not. However, this can really be used to build a kind of personal relationship with a product by giving it an identity. And yes, as I said, it can be used to abstract or distant violent or disturbing actions. And also in combination with kind of that, vague collective we, we know what our freedom costs. Again, who is we and what do we know? It's interesting, of course, that it might be used to assign that kind of shared knowledge or shared culture. So when you see a sentence like that, you might start suspecting that this text has this very kind of patriotic or maybe kind of very nationalist bias to it, because it's already implying that collective knowledge, a collective culture that a group of people share. Does everyone actually know this? Tricky. And it might actually be a sentence that's trying to kind of force these ideals upon people. So again, it's one thing when you see one sentence with this, but a whole different thing where you start seeing a whole pattern. Relational. So relational processes are, 95% of them are the word is. And they describe being. And they can take on two possible patterns of participants. Carrier, so the thing that is, and attribute, what that thing is. Or they can have an identifier, who or what is being labeled as a blank, and identifier the label of blank. So one way to think about relational processes is simply a grammatical equal sign. So the police represent the law, the car embodies excellence. You can almost say like the police equals the law, or this car equals excellence. We are the people, we have the power. We equals people, we equals power. So relational processes often make neutral impression, but are in fact very powerful. One thing is because anytime something is stated as an equal sign, well, it's an equation. It's an objective, like almost mathematical construct. Unless something, is not something, well, then it's equal sign crossed out kind of. But, it implies, there's no two ways about it. It's really kind of factual information. It might be used to imply identity or equivalence, so A is like B or A is B, often the foundation of political arguments. So again, we are the people, we have the power, therefore we must make our country great again, or something like that. An alternative, a relational process can be used as an alternative to other process types where agency and conscious choice need to be diminished, because an equal sign doesn't really get into this whole messiness of material actions or the kind of subjectiveness of perception or thinking. It just says, something is or has, like in our military example, the missile has a 95% success rate in combat. Again, here it's not talking about the missile killing people, the missile being, part of a war that's kind of a very violent and tragic series of events. No, it's just, it has a 95% success rate. And again, keep in mind that as everything from the perspective of systemic functional linguistics, it's a choice. So many things could have been said in any of those situations, but that's what was chosen. And then finally we have our verbal processes. So verbal is saying, writing, communicator. And it takes on three possible types of participants. So this is sort of the complicated one. It can have a sayer, the person or thing that is saying something. It can have a receiver who is being told this particular message, and the verbiage, so the content of what's being said. So for example, the police confronted the protesters. This one you can kind of argue that maybe it's another type of process, but actually, suddenly confronted the protesters, it's like the police were just trying to send a message to the protesters. They weren't trying to beat them up. So the police are the sayer, the protesters are the receiver. In our car example, this car will show you real performance. So this car is the sayer, and it's interesting, of course, because again, just like with mental processors, it implies an intelligent sayer. It can be used to humanize inanimate objects and allow you to have a kind of personal relationship with them that wouldn't be possible otherwise. The car, well, cars don't think, cars don't speak, except in advertisements. So this car will show you, so you're the receiver, and real performance is the verbiage. And again, for example, if you happen to be doing a project on advertising and you really want to figure out, what are values or what are kind of, important things applied by a particular type of advertising. Let's say you were looking at car advertising. So what you could do is you look at a bunch of car ads. You might notice a pattern of verbal processes. A car will show, this car will, give you the feeling of, which is, exactly the same thing as saying something. And you might really start focusing on the verbiages. So the verbiage is kind of the really important, it shows what's really important about advertising. It's real performance, or it might be real safety, or it might be absolute comfort. And so by showing, let's say in your study, by demonstrating that these things take the role of verbiage over and over and over in many different ads, you might be able to have a study on your hands that shows exactly how car advertising presents its key values through patterns of verbiage. Very academic way of thinking about it. Verbal processes can also be used as alternatives to material processes to frame violent or troubling situations to seem less intense. So, for example, the missile strike was reported as a success, instead of saying, the missile strike killed this person and also several bystanders or something like that. It might say the missile strike was reported as a success. Suddenly it's about the reporting. It's not about all this nasty business of killing and attacking. So, and that's a choice. Again, this was the kind of thing that in my master's thesis I was very keen on finding, these patterns of how is violence distanced away from the audience? How is it made less real, less emotional, less immediate, in order to make it kind of more palatable? And we also have behavioral processes, which are interesting because they can only have one type of participant. So behavioral processes are about behaving. It can be kind of a tricky subjective analysis, but whenever you see something that is a complex, conscious, organized behavior, that's usually a behavioral processes. The difference between something like, let's say, a mental or a material process and behavioral processes, behavior is usually something that occurs systematically over and over. So, for example, saying the protesters protested. Protests are complex things. They involve many different people. They involve organizers. They might involve banners and signs, slogans. They might involve scheduling and things of that sort. So it's organized, difficult behavior that's, not just done by individual people, but usually as part of institutions, groups, and society. You can say the same about something like travel. Travel is a very complicated thing if you think about it. It involves, travel agents and travel agencies, bookings, airplane tickets, hotels, highways, driving, walking, and so on and so forth, passing through border controls, having a visa or a passport. And when you say something like the car travels in style, you're implying a lot about what that car can do. So it's kind of borderline between mental and material, active behavior rather than passive. And one way to tell if something is a behavioral process versus a mental process is like, what are you doing? I'm meditating. That is a behavioral process. Again, meditation is a complex thing. Whereas with something like believe, what are you doing? I am believing. Well, that, believing is a mental process, The only exception might be, in that song for, don't stop believing. In the context of that song, okay, you might be able to say believing. But in general, I am believing is not a sentence that you can say. You could say I believe, but you can't say I am believing. So, and you can say I am protesting, I am traveling, I am working, I am functioning, or the missile is functioning. So, and again, notice that it only has one type of participant. So with something like the missile function as expected during the mission, because it only concerns the behavior, you can leave out, what the function of it is, which is, it's to kill people or to destroy things. And when you say something like the missile function as expected during the mission, you don't even have to mention what the mention is. And that way you can sort of draw the audience's attention away from the violence of it. And that's important, especially when you see it as a pattern. And the last type of process is existential. It's just existing, and it also takes on only one participant, who are what exists. This is something that you see very rarely in common everyday speech. You might see it in something like laws exist for a reason, or cars exist for a reason. But in general, it's relatively rare, which is why anytime that you see something about existence show up in normal everyday language, that's already interesting. It can be really important to legal, political, religious, or philosophical arguments, but existential processes, you don't see them in regular everyday English. You certainly see them more in specialized register. One example I can give you is, for example, anytime you're looking at religious texts, because to religious texts, the idea of, let's say, the existence of God or many gods, that's a very crucial point of any religious text. So they will have quite a few ways of describing existence. Whereas, you really don't see that much of it in modern everyday English. It might be different in other languages, and, keep in mind that modern everyday English has really kind of evolved away from religious discourse in a way that, many other cultures, for example, they use a lot more kind of religious metaphors or religious expressions where suddenly, you do see a lot more existential processes. And circumstances, in systemic functional linguistics, just to give you a brief rundown, is, if we go back to something like the missile function as expected during the mission, and as expected are both circumstances. So during the mission is a type of circumstance of location, time, when, during the mission. Missile function as expected, that is a circumstance of manner, and it's describing quality. So how did the mission function? As expected. So most of the time, circumstances are expressed through prepositional phrases. So as expected, or during the mission, or for the future of our people. Those are circumstances. And again, you're not just looking for individual labels. What you're really interested in is patterns. And there's many of these other ones. I'll, leave the slides. So if you're analyzing these, then you can really focus in. So for example, let's say if you are interested in, let's say you're looking at texts that are describing, confrontations between police and the protesters, and you're really interested in how the authors of your text represent why that is happening. And so you might start paying really close attention to circumstances of cause for reasons. Why was the protest happening? Or the purpose, what were they trying to achieve? Or behalf, on whose behalf? Versus, how is it portrayed for the protesters? Were they, protesting because they are appalled at something that's going on in the world? Are they protesting, because their purpose is to cause trouble? Are the police just trying to keep their voices down? Or are the police, doing the kind of suppression of protests on behalf of law and order or on behalf of people? So this is something that's important. So this is just an example of how, out of those three big functions, this is the ideational. The participants, processes, and circumstances at the level of lexicogrammar. This, what we talked about here. This is how you can use systemic functional linguistics to do analysis. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go through the other two functions, but just to very quickly give you an overview. So interpersonal functions, for example, when you're talking about implied attitude or mood in the text, you look at two systems, mood and modality. So mood, it's looking at the type of sentence it is. There's actually two types of mood. There's kind of big mood versus lowercase mood, mood of clause, but they kind of work in parallel. So basically, it's what type of sentence it is. So, for example, in a text, sentences can be of one of these types. So a sentence can be a statement. A statement can be, or a sentence can be a question, a sentence can be a command, a sentence can be an offer, it could be an answer to a question. And again, as in anything, it's a choice. You might say, I had toast and milk for breakfast. Statement of fact. Question, what did you have for breakfast? That can be open or closed. Did you have toast for breakfast? So that's a closed, yes or no question versus, what did you have for breakfast? That's an open-ended question. Command, pass the toast, please, or let's go have breakfast. It can be inclusive or exclusive. So, it can be something like, you do this for me, or we do this together. Offer, would you like something? Or, yes, I would. So, and again, when you're analyzing patterns of it, consider, for example, is there a lot of questions in the text that you're analyzing? Are they open-ended questions, or are they just questions with either or? Because that's one of the ways that, for example, a text with a particular bias might be trying to steer you towards that bias. So, for example, this kind of idea, either you're supporting law and order, or you're with the protesters, which means in that case, you don't support law and order. Well, is there any other options in that sentence? But if, you have a political speech that hammers down on this, it's either, you're with us or against us kind of mentality. That's a choice, and that's a very deliberate choice, especially when you see it in a pattern. And modality is basically kind of the attitude. So it's usually expressed through modal verbs and adverbs. So words like can, should, must, could, and adverbs, highly, very, possibly. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but basically, when you see patterns of this, they might be telling, this. For example, if you're really trying to create doubt in your audience or make them question something, is you say, well, they might, this may be true, this is probably true, this is possibly true. Is it though? So again, pay attention to modal verbs and adverbs. Anytime you see a pattern of these, you may be able to analyze it into one of these categories and make a solid argument based on it. And finally, so that was our very quick overview of interpersonal meaning, and here we get to textual meaning. So textual meaning is looking at information structure. I'm not going to go through the entire thing, so, information structure can be things like patterns of reference. Information structure can be things that, how is something organized into paragraphs. Information structure can even look at things like strategic pauses, for example, in a speech. I will show you one trick, for example, theme versus rime. So in English, the theme of a sentence, so what a sentence is about, is always at the front. Theme of an unmarked declarative sentence, so a theme of an ordinary statement, is usually the subject. So, for example, John went to school. John is the theme of that sentence. Went to school is the reme, or the rest of that sentence. What's important is that it implies that the sentence is about John. When we go back to one of our previous examples, just to go here, let's say, the police confronted the protesters. The sentence is about the police. We will tell the truth no matter what. That sentence is about we. Or here, for example, the missile functioned as expected during the mission. The missile is the theme of the sentence, but when we go back a couple of slides, sorry, not this one, here, the target was identified from suddenly the target is the theme of that sentence, even though it's talking about the exact same situation, missile being launched at a target. That's a choice. And if you see a pattern of that choice, that's useful. So, if you see things suddenly being moved around in a sentence, you might say, well, actually, John didn't go to school. If you start putting things before John, suddenly, well, actually, John didn't go to school. This is why people, when they're being dishonest or trying to make excuses, instead of saying, I didn't do it, they might say, well, actually, you know what? I didn't really have a chance to do that. So, that's a pattern of hiding. These are different types of themes. Sentence is getting a bit loaded, and it's really trying to distance, in this case, John, or in another case, it might be, missiles, weapons, whatever, the police. It's trying to put them as far away from the beginning of the sentence as it can in order to not make them the focus. And if you see a pattern of it, you can write a whole paper about it. Or as for school, John never, as for school, he never went there, John, that is. So here again, John is as far to the back of the sentence as possible. Or, it's like, as for what happened at the protests, well, the police kind of had to push the protesters out and arrest some of them. Again, it's moving it's moving the actor. When we talked about material processes, it's still using a material process, but it's organizing the sentence in such a way that it's moving things as far from the theme as possible. So this, by the way, is true in English. It may be different in other languages, particularly languages where it's written, not left to right as in English, but right to left. Similar to it, and, these are in no way in contradiction. They can, those two things can perfectly well, map onto each other. Given versus new. So in English, given and new generally corresponds to theme and reme. So whatever is first in the sentence is usually implied to be given information, and whatever is after that is implied to be the new information. So, for example, compare these two sentences. Great news from our partners in Australia today versus our partners in Australia have some great news for us today. So the first sentence, why would you even say that sentence in two different ways? Of course, those are perfectly grammatical sentences. And people say these things for some reason, right? So in the first example, great news is the given. So in other words, it's like, oh, okay, so you start off the sentence to say that we're going to have great news today. You don't have to worry about it. It's all great news from our partners in Australia. It's like, oh, okay, so it's from Australia. Whereas here, it's like our partners in Australia. It's like, yeah, we know. We have partners in Australia. Have some great news for us today. Oh, okay, so, great. What's the news? So this is kind of subtle, but again, think about how that might be used in kind of a more politically loaded today text, for example. You might say, if you want to describe something as inherently good, you start off by saying, this is great news, great news from, this country that we've been fighting a war in today. their dictator has been killed or something like that. So it starts off the sentence by already assuming that it's great news. And, it makes it kind of, it already sort of primes the reader of that text to perceive it in a certain way. So that's, something that's interesting. And again, keep in mind that in other languages, it may be different, particularly languages that are read from right to left instead of left to right. Often it's actually backwards, that the new thing is what's at the start of the sentence, and what's given or what's assumed to be already common knowledge or what's assumed to be the default norm is towards the end of the sentence. So that's quite interesting. It's also interesting that English actually works, or I should say kind of Western English-speaking culture works that same way visually. So, you might have something very similar going on with structure of pictures. So very often, this is why what's kind of on the left of a picture is the given, and what's on the right of the picture is the new. This is why, not true universally, but especially when you look at things like websites and menus, often menu is at the top and or along the left side. It's interesting. So the given, the given always kind of focuses on this corner, and the new moves towards kind of this corner down here, which is really interesting. So this is just some examples. There's a lot more to systemic functional linguistics, and I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of how this fits into this broader framework of CDA. So as we said at the beginning, the SFL is sort of the description of the language in all of its detail. Systemic functional linguistics. CDA, and it sort of explains what things are. So, once you know CDA, you can label things as theme or rime, or you can label different types of mood modality, or, you can label things as different types of processes. But in CDA, now that you know what things are, you can start coming up with an explanation of why those choices within those systems of language or communication, why those choices were made. So to come back to the definition, so it's made up of 3 parts. Critical. So critical meaning involving careful judgment or evaluation. It doesn't necessarily mean, being all negative critical on the language. Discourse is, when we talk about discourse, we talk about discourse as like a mode of organizing knowledge, ideas, experience that's rooted in language and its concrete contexts. So in other words, it's, a way of communicating that's usually expressed through a set of artifacts. So you might be studying, let's say, if you're studying discourse of racism in news media, that's a particular discourse that exists within which you might have things like news articles or news articles within different media outlets. All of those things are part of the discourse. And analysis, so analysis meaning a detailed examination of anything complex in order to understand its nature and determine its essential features. So those are kind of the standard Merriam-Webster sort of dictionary definitions. And yes, so when you're doing critical discourse analysis, at the core, that's what you're doing. You're making very careful judgments, very careful of evaluations of some kind of mode of transmitting information through, and you're looking at it in a way that's detailed and systematic, and where you can actually bring in a method like SFL, Systemic Functional Linguistics, to justify your analysis and ultimately come up with some kind of judgment or evaluation. So let's say CDA is used exactly for things like, let's say, talking about language and power, or language and racism, language and justice. And you might actually use methods of systemic functional linguistics to say something like, here is how we can look at language that is, let's say inherently racist or inherently sexist. Here is why it's that way. Here is how we can show it through the systems of language, and maybe even how we can kind of challenge it or change that language to avoid those problems. So a lot of this comes from, at least in the way that I talk about it, from the work of Norman Fairclough, who I believe you might have already encountered in this course. So CDA is concerned with consent, transmission of ideology, practices, meanings, values, identities as achieved through discourse. Power and control are central to critical discourse analysis, so a lot of it is about power relations. You'll notice even when we were going through our little examples, like going back to the processes, we're talking about the police, we're talking about advertising, this we the people sounds like political speech, and talking about missiles and targets, that's military jargon. So those are all things involving a lot of power and control, which are real focus areas for CDA. And CDA in particular is interested in mechanisms of control. How are discourses of politics, of policing, of military, of violence, of all of those other things, how are they constructed? And how do they set acceptable norms for what is and what is not allowed in society? So again, this is why, for example, we often see texts that avoid talking about violence very directly, because violence falls outside the norm. Injustice falls outside the norm. Therefore, we just, we might still do those things, or we as a society might still be kind of complicit in violence, injustice, and all of those other things, but we don't really talk about them, or we use all these linguistic tools, linguistic ways of, even the grammar of language might be used to kind of hide away and distance those things from us because they're outside the norm. So media in particular is a focus of critical discourse analysis because media is a public record. And media looks at, construction of things like race and immigration, climate change in the environment, gender, identity and sexuality. For example, looking at lifestyle media or influencers. So if you're interested in doing, let's say, your mini course project in one of these areas, you might consider CDA and systemic functional linguistics as a framework for doing your analysis. CDA, working hand in hand with what we just talked about in systemic functional linguistics, it'll also talk about things like marked versus unmarked. So we already talked about, active versus passive versus agentless passive. It might point to patterns in language like, police arrested the protesters. So here, recalling CDA, we have a actor, material, process, goal. Now we have protesters arrested by police. Suddenly, unmarked. So basically here we have a normal active voice, declarative sentence. This is the most vanilla sentence possible. And if you're trying to kind of, that's called unmarked. That's the default. However, as soon as you start creating these unusual structures like passives, that's what we call marking something. So here, protesters is marked. Suddenly it's really drawing attention or drawing focus to protesters. And it might also even make, the police suddenly disappear from the sentence. So, or John ate dinner, dinner eater by John, dinner eaten, which is really, if you say something like, those are grammatically the same things, right? Police arrested protesters, John ate dinner, dinner eaten by John, protesters arrested by police. But protesters arrested, dinner eaten, would you ever say that about an actual living person, dinner eaten, and yet protesters arrested? You might actually see that as a headline in a newspaper. Why do we see this, but we don't really, I'd be surprised if any of you ever said a sentence like this in your life. So why is this common in headlines? And those whys are exactly what CDA looks at. So CDA critical discourse analysis takes a kind of three-step analysis where in order to answer those whys, it will take 3 steps. And I've linked an article that you can go through, which really shows you how to do that 3-step analysis, which is, first step is identification. So you identify themes, ideas, stereotypes, cultural values that are invoked or described in the text. So what does this text say about things like gender norms, morals, shared experiences, situational humor, idealized representation, things like idealized food, idealized cars, idealized bodies, And then you can use SFL to explain, what is represented, how are these things evaluated. Actually, appraisal, I won't talk about it, we're out of time, but that's another method of looking at it. So first you identify what it is that you want to talk about. For example, if you're interested, again, in the topic of, let's say, racism or race in Canadian news media, okay, first step is to ask, what does your text, so in this case, what does the news media say about race? What does it say about stereotypes of race? What does it say about what's acceptable, not acceptable in our society? Second step is interpretation. And there's 2 types of interpretation. So situational, who produces the product or service being advertised. This is, talking about advertising discourse, but you can apply it to news media. Who produces the news outlet? Who creates who creates the message? Who is in the active and passive roles? That's in the case of advertisement, but you can also apply it to other types of discourse. So for example, in news media, if you're talking about police versus protesters, who is in the active roles? Police or protesters? Who's in the passive roles? Police or protesters? And also intertextual. So what kind of relationships are implied or mediated by the ad? So in advertising, you have a whole group of relationship. You have the relationship between the product and the producer. This product is great because it's made by this company with decades of experience. Product consumer, you're going to have a great relationship with our product. Producer consumer, you are trusting us because we have all this experience. And again, to take the example of police versus protesters, how is that relationship described? And more importantly, how is that described in relation to the audience? Are the audience made to identify with the protesters, with the police? Who are they supposed to side with? So this is a combination of your own analysis and also of external sources. So for example, when you're doing situational analysis, you might want to read up on where your text comes from. Let's say you're analyzing Canadian news media. So it's a good idea to go out and learn something about who publishes that newspaper, who are its readers, who sponsors the advertising in it. And finally, the third step is the context analysis. So what social practices are mediated by this text? So looking at, in advertising, fast food, business culture, education, beauty or gender norms, or, if you're looking at something like discourse of, let's say, violent protest, or just protest in general, is, what does this fit into? Does this just fit into politics, or does it affect more things than just politics? Does it, affect civil and human rights? Is it really about economics and things of that sort? Or in the case of advertisement, how does your text construct a particular reality? How does it relate to reality as it is? Does it reinforce or challenge existing power relations? To what ends? So, you can look at it as, something as trivial as, how cars are described in car advertisements. And what does it say about what we value about driving and what we value about ourselves? So, for example, in car advertisements, often underneath all of that is this idea of personal choice, of freedom to travel, of, this idea of performance and high-tech coolness of things. But there's also, underneath that, there's kind of this very capitalist consumer mentality, important to keep in mind. So again, Here, when you're doing context analysis, you always must refer to external, peer-reviewed academic sources to make a successful argument about this. Because you really can't say those things on your own. Like, you can't just say that, the text relates to kind of existing discussions of race and protest in our society. Well, how do you know that? You should probably go and read something, even just some kind of analytical source about, the history of protest in modern society. And then you can start talking about values and, power relations and things like that. And so again, all of that, you can do it at all these different levels. In particular, this maps onto this context bit and what Sfl and Cda describe as genres and registers. So, the genre might be news media, and register might be, different types of newspaper articles, editorials, advertisements, and so on and so forth. And so this kind of forms this complete framework of Sfl and Cda. You can go from descriptions of context, from descriptions of social situations, all the way down to the grammar, and even, things as trivial as choices of fonts or uses of phonetics and phonology, how, a news presenter uses a tone of voice to present something. Yes, so this is just to give you kind of a final summary before we wrap up. Systemic functional linguistics. We talked today about systemic functional linguistics, or SFL, critical discourse analysis, and CDA. CDA being a perspective on wider context, looking at power and control, and looking at, trends on discourse, looking at the why, why things are said the way they are. Systemic functional linguistics is really a perspective on kind of the nitty-gritty formal structures of language. It's composed of 3 metafunctions. So the ideational, or the content of a text, the interpersonal, the relationships and attitudes implied by the text, and textual, so the organization of information in the text. So it is often used as a set of tools to answer these broader questions that critical discourse analysis asks about power and control, media discourse, trends, power, social relations. Finally, just to mention, there is some criticism of CDA, and, as a responsible academic, you have to be mindful of it. So, one thing to keep in mind, especially as you go into reading work that's done within CDA, unlike many approaches in linguistics, traditional linguistics is really looked at as a science. In other words, it's this sort of objective, neutral thing that looks at language as it is. It doesn't, traditional linguistics doesn't have very much to say about, power and control and those kinds of things. And it certainly doesn't try to push a particular perspective. However, CDA is explicitly political. For example, Toon van Dijk, who is kind of one of the big names in critical discourse analysis, even calls it dissident research paradigm. So it is overtly politically and socially left-wing approach to looking at discourse. And some people don't see that as positive. Some people see that as, it's basically a academic form of propaganda. It's not sufficiently academic because it's not neutral. That's fair to point out. I don't think that delegitimizes it in any way. I think it's still very valid research, but certainly the vast majority of work in it is explicitly political and explicitly takes a stance on it. I think for many of you, you might find it very empowering to do critical discourse analysis, because instead of just kind of, beating around the bush and trying to imply something about, language and race, or language and injustice, or language and violence, you can really, CDA encourages researchers to say things, and say, no, this is racist language. This is language that's excusing violence. This is language that supports existing power institutions, which is which is fair. But again, if this is not the route that appeals to you, if this is not the kind of approach to analysis that you want to take part in, then, well, maybe CDA is not an approach that you want to take. So that will wrap it up for me. I will leave my presentation, kind of both a short summary and some extra slides as well, if particularly you're interested in advertising discourse. We've already gone on for quite a long time. Thank you for sticking with me. I hope this was interesting, and good luck in the rest of your term. Good luck with your final projects, which I'm sure will be exciting. So, if you are dealing with something that sounds like critical discourse analysis might fit in, consider it. And there are some great resources available online. Again, I'll leave some links in my slides that you can follow up on. In particular, I do want to point to this right here. So this Fairclough article, it's a very good summary of how you do that 3-step analysis method. So the nice thing about this Sfl Cda approach is it's a very step-by-step how-to guide to doing analysis. It's not general, it's not vague, it's very specific. So with that, I hope you have a great day. Thank you for listening, and take care.